The rancher thought it was just an injured Mustang until he saw what was hidden underneath. Out on the storm-swept range, a weary rancher lifts a tangled horse from the wire only to find a secret strapped beneath its belly. A secret so dangerous it could tear the whole valley apart. In his barn, under the crackle of lantern light, he discovers more than just the wounded beast. A woman in hiding. A story of promises broken, and papers that could change who truly owns the river itself. But when the railroad men come thundering with deputies at their side, kindness turns into a battle for justice. The horse bleeds, the town divides. The jail door slams shut. Will the rancher risk his land, his freedom, and his very life, too? Stand by the truth hidden under a dying Mustang. Comment below and tell me where in the world you're joining from. And if this story made you pause for a moment, hit that subscribe button for more. The bitter wind whipped across William Hardin's face as he guided his horse along the fence line. Dawn painted the winter sky in shades of pewter, offering little warmth to chase away the bone-deep chill. His shoulders slumped under the weight of worry about the cattle he'd lost, about the stack of unpaid bills in his desk drawer, about keeping food on the table for little Clara. The storm had been fierce last night. Already, he'd found 3 sections of fence down, posts scattered like broken teeth across the frozen ground. His gloved hands were raw from repairs, but he couldn't afford to leave any gaps where his remaining cattle might stray. That's when he heard a shrill whinny of distress cutting through the morning quiet. William pulled his horse to a stop, listening. There it came again, desperate and wild. He found the Mustang thrashing in a tangle of barbed wire near the creek bed. The horse's dark coat was streaked with blood where the cruel metal had bit deep. Its eyes rolled white with panic as William approached, hooves churning the mud. "Easy there," he murmured, keeping his voice low and steady. Easy now. The practical thing would be to put the poor creature down. He even reached for his pistol, fingers brushing the worn grip. But something made him pause. The Mustang was a fine specimen beneath the blood and wire, strong-boned with good lines. The kind of horse that didn't just run wild in these parts. William moved closer, speaking soft and slow. The horse's struggles weakened as exhaustion set in. That's when he noticed something odd. A canvas strap secured under its belly, nearly hidden by mud and matted hair. His heart quickened. This was no ordinary stray. Working carefully, he managed to calm the horse enough to check the strap. There was a leather pouch attached, about the size of his hand. The Mustang tensed as he worked the buckle free, but held steady. Inside the pouch, William found papers, official-looking documents stained with what could only be blood. His stomach turned as he recognized the elaborate seal of the Indian Agency. These were treaty papers, legal documents meant to protect native lands. But what caught his eye was a name written in careful script. Kim 10 Skies. He knew that name. Everyone in the territory had heard about the fire that had claimed the life of John 10 Skies, one of the few Indian Agency translators trusted by both sides. His widow Kim had vanished in the aftermath, leaving folks to whisper their theories in saloons and general stores. Some said she'd returned to her people. Others hinted at darker fates. Beneath the treaties was a child's drawing done in colored pencil, a simple scene showing a house, a horse, and 3 stick figures holding hands. The paper was crumpled but carefully smoothed out again, as if it had been handled often. William's hands shook slightly as he returned the items to the pouch. This was bigger than a stray horse. These papers meant something, and the blood on them meant trouble. The Mustang watched him warily as he began the slow work of freeing it from the wire. Each barb had to be handled carefully to prevent further damage. The morning grew colder, but sweat beaded on William's forehead as he concentrated on the delicate task. "You've had quite a journey, haven't you?" he said softly, noting the miles of dried mud caked on the horse's legs. "Let's get you somewhere safe while we figure this out." It took over an hour to extract the horse from the wire. The animal was exhausted enough to follow docilely as William led it back toward his ranch, his own mount trailing behind. His mind churned with questions. Where had this horse come from? Why were treaty papers hidden beneath its belly? The most troubling, whose blood stained those documents? Evening shadows were stretching across the yard when they finally reached his corral. William's ranch hand, Tom, came out to help settle the Mustang in with fresh hay and water. The horse's wounds weren't as bad as they'd first appeared, painful but not life-threatening. "Found it tangled in the fence line," William explained briefly, not mentioning the pouch now hidden in his saddlebag. Something told him to keep that discovery close for now, as he watched the Mustang drink deeply from the water trough. Unease settled in his gut like a cold stone. He'd seen enough trouble in his years on the frontier to know when more was brewing. Those papers meant something to somebody willing to shed blood over them. And now whatever storm was coming had blown onto his land, brought by a wild horse and hidden papers bearing the name of a missing widow. William patted the saddlebag containing the pouch, feeling the weight of the mystery it held. The sun sank behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire that reminded him too much of blood. The storm that had brought the wild Mustang still rattled the window panes as William and Clara sat down to their evening meal. The lamp cast warm shadows across the wooden table where a simple supper of beans, cornbread, and dried apple slices waited. William bowed his head, speaking the familiar words of grace, while Clara fidgeted in her chair. "Uncle William," Clara whispered as soon as the prayer ended, "I heard noises up in the loft while you were out fixing fence today." William paused with his spoon halfway to his mouth. "What kind of noises? Like someone moving around in the hay?" Clara's bright eyes were serious. "I thought maybe it was just mice, but it sounded bigger." "Probably just the wind," William said, though his shoulders tensed. He hadn't told Clara about finding the Mustang or the blood-stained papers. No sense worrying her with troubles that weren't hers to bear. "No, I'm certain it wasn't the wind." Clara pushed her beans around her plate. "It sounded like somebody breathing. Like when Ma used to check on me at night, thinking I was asleep." William's chest tightened at the mention of his brother's wife. Clara spoke of her parents more freely now, but the loss still hung heavy in the air between them. A soft thump came from above, followed by what could only be a muffled cough. "There." Clara's eyes went wide. "Did you hear it?" William set down his spoon and reached for the lantern. "Stay here," he said firmly. "I'll check it out, but Uncle William, Clara." His voice was gentle but brooked no argument. "Stay put." The ladder to the hayloft creaked under his weight as he climbed, lantern held high. The flame's glow caught dust motes dancing in the air and threw long shadows across the hay bales. At first glance, nothing seemed amiss. Then he saw her, huddled in the deepest corner of the loft. Wrapped in what looked like an old horse blanket was a woman. Her dark hair fell in tangles around a face drawn tight with exhaustion and cold. Even in the dim light, William could see the angry red of frostbite on her cheeks and fingers. "Mrs. Ten Skies," he said quietly, recognizing her from the few times he'd seen her in town with her husband. Her eyes met his, wary but unwavering. "Mr. Hardin." Her voice was hoarse, but carried a dignity that seemed to fill the space between them. "You followed the Mustang." It wasn't a question. She nodded, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "That horse was John's wedding gift to me." The last thing that connects me to her voice caught, and she pressed her lips together before continuing. "To my husband, to everything we worked for." William set the lantern down on a hay bale, keeping his movements slow and careful. "Those papers in the pouch, they're important enough for someone to keel over. They're important enough for someone to die protecting." Kim's words carried the weight of grief and fierce determination. John believed in what those documents promised: a fair share of the river water for my people, access to the fishing grounds our grandmothers used. He died making sure those promises weren't forgotten. Murdered, William said softly, remembering. Her earlier words, Kim's eyes flashed. The fire that killed him wasn't an accident, but I can't prove it, not yet. A violent shiver ran through her body, and she couldn't quite suppress a groan of pain. William studied her, noting how she cradled her frostbitten hands close to her body, how her shoulders trembled with cold despite her efforts to hide it. The decent thing would be to help her. But decency could be dangerous out here on the frontier, where taking sides could turn neighbors against you faster than a prairie fire. Please, Kim said, reading his hesitation. I only need shelter until I can travel again. A few days to recover my strength, then I'll go. From below came the sound of Clara's voice singing softly to herself as she cleared the supper dishes. The familiar hymn floated up through the floorboards. Amazing Grace. How sweet the sound. William closed his eyes briefly, remembering his own brother's dying words. Take care of my girl, Will. Do right by her. Do right. Sometimes the path of doing right was as clear as a mountain stream. Other times it twisted like a rattler in the grass. You can stay, he said finally, but only until you're well enough to travel safely. He picked up the lantern, its light catching the relief that washed across Kim's face. I'll bring you up some supper and extra blankets. We've got a store of liniment that might help with the frostbite. Thank you, Kim said simply, but the words carried the weight of a solemn promise. Clara knows someone's up here, William warned. She's 12, and not much gets past her. A ghost of a smile touched Kim's lips. Children see clearly what adults sometimes miss. William nodded, then made his way back down the ladder, his mind already turning over the complications this decision would bring. When he returned to the kitchen, Clara was drying the last plate, still humming. Did you find anything, Uncle William? Just some work I need to finish up, he said, filling a plate with beans and cornbread. I'll be up there a while longer. You best get ready for bed. Clara's eyes tracked him as he gathered blankets and the jar of liniment, but she didn't press for answers. Sometimes she was so much like her mother, it made his heart ache. Later that night, Clara was asleep and Kim had eaten. William sat at his desk with the treaty papers spread before him. The lamp's flame guttered in the draft as he studied the careful lines of text. Water rights. Fishing access. Promises made in good faith by men in distant offices to people who had lived along these rivers since before anyone thought to draw borders on maps. John, 10 skies had died believing in these promises. His widow now lay hidden in William's hayloft, refusing to let them be forgotten. And William himself had just tied his fate to theirs with 2 simple words. You can stay. Outside, the storm pressed against the walls of the house, its wild voice rising and falling like a prayer. Or maybe a warning. William carefully folded the papers and returned them to their pouch. Whatever trouble was coming, he'd made his choice. Now he'd have to live with it. The morning sun cast long shadows across the barn as William tended to the Mustang's wounds. His fingers worked carefully, cleaning dried blood from the barbed wire cuts that crossed the horse's flank. The animal stood quietly now, head lowered, as if understanding the gentle intention behind William's touch. Easy there, he murmured, applying a thick paste of herbs and lard to the deepest gash. The Mustang's coat, though dusty, showed signs of regular care. This was no wild horse, but one that had known a kind hand. The barn door creaked, and William tensed until he recognized Clara's light footsteps. Uncle William. She carried a steaming cup of broth, her face bright with purpose. I thought maybe our guest might be hungry. William straightened, studying his niece's expression. "So you knew." Clara nodded. "I heard you talking last night," and she hesitated. "I took her some water this morning when you were out checking the cattle. Clara, she was shivering something awful. Uncle William. I couldn't just leave her up there in the cold." William sighed, but couldn't fight the smile tugging at his mouth. Clara had her mother's heart, seeing need and moving to meet it without hesitation. "Well," he said, wiping his hands on a rag, "reckon we might as well make her more comfortable. The loft's no place for someone recovering from frostbite." They found Kim in the kitchen, huddled close to the wood stove. Her dark eyes watched them carefully as they entered, but softened when Clara approached with the broth. "Thank you, little one," Kim said, accepting the cup with trembling hands. The frostbite had left angry patches on her fingers, but William noted with relief that the damage wasn't as severe as he'd feared. Clara pulled up a chair beside Kim. "I'm Clara," she said. "Uncle William's my guardian now, since Ma and Pa went to heaven." Kim's expression gentled. "I am sorry for your loss, Clara. Among my people, we say that those who have walked on still watch over us, like stars in this night sky." "I like that," Clara said softly. "Sometimes I talk to them at night, when I can't sleep. That is good. They hear you." William watched the exchange, struck by how naturally the two connected, despite their different worlds. But his moment of peace was broken by the sound of boots on the porch. Mr. Hardin. Jake Matthews, one of his ranch hands, stood in the doorway, his eyes fixed on Kim, then darted away. "Could I have a word?" Outside, the morning air carried a bite of frost. Jake shifted his weight, hat twisted in his hands. "Some of the boys are worried, sir. Word's bound to get out about." He glanced toward the house. "Well, about your guest. Folks in town won't take kindly to it." "Mrs. Ten Skies is recovering from frostbite," William said firmly. "I'm not in the habit of turning away those in need. No disrespect meant, but she's Comanche." And with all the tension lately over grazing rights, Jake's voice trailed off. "I appreciate your concern," William said, keeping his tone even. "But my decision stands." Back inside, he found Kim and Clara. Bent over a piece of paper, Clara was drawing something, while Kim watched with genuine interest. "This is our ranch," Clara was explaining, "and here's where the river bends around the willows. That's the best spot for fishing." "I know this bend," Kim said. "My grandmother's people camped there in summer, when the fish were running." She touched the paper gently. "The treaties promised we could still fish there." William pulled up a chair. "Tell me about these treaties." Kim set down her cup, her face growing serious. "My husband John worked as a translator for the Indian Agency. He believed in building bridges between our peoples." Her voice caught slightly. "The papers prove that the river's grazing lands were promised to be shared. Equal access for all. Rancher and Comanche alike. That's why someone wanted them destroyed." Kim nodded. "John discovered that certain men planned to ignore the treaties. When he threatened to expose them, she didn't need to finish. The burned remnants of her homestead told that story clearly enough. These are powerful men. Men who believe they can write their own laws." Kim's voice hardened. "They think because John is dead, the truth died with him. But he made copies of everything. The papers your Mustang carried are proof that can't be denied." William leaned back, running a hand through his hair. What she said was true, and something in his gut told him it was. Sheltering her put everything he'd built at risk. The ranch was mortgaged to its limit. One word from the wrong person could bring it all crashing down. Clara's voice broke into his thoughts. "We have to help her, don't we, Uncle William? It's what Pa would do." William looked at his niece's earnest face, then at Kim's quiet dignity. He thought of John Ten Skies, who died believing in justice, and of his own brother. who'd taught him that doing right wasn't always the same as doing what was easy. "Yes," he said finally. "We do." As evening approached, William led Kim to the small bedroom off the kitchen. Clara had already made up the bed with fresh linens and laid out some of her mother's old clothes. "It's not much," William said, "but it's warmer than the loft." "It is more than enough." Kim stood in the doorway, her presence somehow making the modest room feel more dignified. "You risk much by helping me. Maybe." William met her steady. "Gaze, but some risks are worth taking." The last light of day filtered through the window, painting the room in soft gold. In that moment, William saw not a Comanche widow or a political refuge, but simply a woman of strength and grace, fighting for what was right. From the kitchen came the sounds of Clara humming as she prepared supper. The familiar tune drifted through the house, bridging the space between worlds that suddenly didn't seem so far apart. "Rest," William said softly. "You're safe here." Kim nodded, the simple gesture carrying the weight of trust, earned and given. As William turned to leave, he caught a glimpse of her removing a small beaded pouch from around her neck. Something precious, saved from the fire. Perhaps. Another piece of the story he was only beginning to understand. Outside, the Mustang nickered softly in the barn, its wounds beginning to heal. Like its mistress, it had found temporary shelter in the storm. Whether that shelter would hold against what was coming remained to be seen. But for now, in the gathering dusk, it was enough. William rose before dawn, his mind heavy with thoughts that had chased sleep away all night. The first pale light crept through his window as he pulled on his boots and heavy coat. In the kitchen, he scribbled a note for Clara, explaining he needed supplies from town. The wagon's wheels creaked as he hitched up his team. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, covering their tracks from previous days, a small blessing. As he worked, William caught movement at the upstairs window. Kim stood there briefly, her silhouette distinct against the lamplight, before disappearing like a shadow. "Watch over Clara," he'd told her earlier. "Stay inside, away from the windows." Kim had simply nodded, understanding the weight of silence. The morning air bit sharp and clean as William guided the wagon down the long drive. Snow crunched beneath the wheels, and his breath frosted in small clouds. The familiar route to town stretched before him, but today it felt different. Each familiar landmark, the lightning-struck oak, Miller's broken fence. The creek crossing seemed to ask if he was sure about the path he'd chosen. These were his neighbors' lands he passed, good people who'd helped when his brother died, leaving William with Clara to raise. Folks who'd pitched in during harvest, who'd sat beside him in church, who'd brought food when grief was still fresh. The wagon jolted over a rut, and William adjusted his grip on the reins. "Easy there," he murmured to the horses. Though his words were meant more for himself, the sun had cleared the horizon by the time he reached town. Already, people moved along the boardwalks, starting their day. William nodded to familiar faces. As he tied his team outside the church, trying to appear unhurried. Ordinary, he found Reverend Amos in his study, warming his hands over a small stove. The preacher looked up from his Bible, reading glasses perched on his nose. "William Hardin," he said warmly. Rather early for a social call. William closed the door carefully behind him. "Need your counsel, Reverend, and your discretion." Amos removed his glasses, folding them deliberately. "Both are freely given, as you know." For a moment, William stood silent, weighing his words. Then, slowly, he began to explain about the injured Mustang, the hidden papers, Kim's appearance, and the terrible choice now facing him. The preacher listened without interruption, his weathered face growing grave. When William finished, Amos rose and checked that the door was fully closed before speaking. "You've stepped into troubled waters, William," he said quietly. "That railroad company's been buying up influence like penny candy. Judge Morrison's boy suddenly has a fine position in their Denver office. Sheriff Taylor's got a new horse. Mighty expensive animal for a lawman's salary. William's stomach tightened. How deep does it go? Deep enough that good men are looking the other way. Amos moved to his desk, pulling out a folder. 3 days ago, a railroad agent named Morton came to see me. Wanted to know if the church might appreciate a generous donation, provided I help convince certain parties that progress shouldn't be hindered by. He paused. Outdated agreements. And what did you tell him? That the Lord's house isn't for sale. Amos smiled grimly. He didn't much care for that answer. William ran a hand through his hair. If what Kim says is true about these treaties, then a lot of powerful men stand to lose face and fortune. Amos leaned forward. William, that woman's life is in danger. Those papers she carries could upset plans years in the making. What would you have me do? Turn her out? No. Amos's voice was firm. But understand what protecting her might cost. Not just your standing with neighbors, but perhaps your ranch itself. These railroad men play rough. I gave my word. William said quietly, then keep it. Amos stood, but be careful. Watch who rides your fence lines. Notice who asks innocent questions. And William? He gripped the younger man's shoulder. Pray. The Lord has a way of making straight paths through wilderness. The morning had warmed slightly when William left the church, though the sun did little to ease his troubled thoughts. He loaded his wagon with actual supplies, flour, coffee, ammunition, maintaining the pretense of a regular trip to town. On the return journey, movement caught his eye near the river bend. 3 men on horseback stood examining maps. There, city clothes and surveying equipment, marking them as railroad men. They barely glanced at William's passing wagon, too intent on their work. But he noticed how their stakes and string lines cut across grazing land that had served both settlers and Comanche for generations. The sun was setting by the time William's wagon rolled into his yard. As he unhitched the team, voices drifted. From the house, Clara's high, clear laugh and another sound he hadn't heard before. Kim's gentle voice, speaking words he didn't understand. William entered quietly through the kitchen door. In the main room, Kim sat cross-legged by the fire. Clara beside her. Both looked up at his entrance, but what struck him was their evident comfort with each other. Uncle William. Clara beamed. Kim's teaching me Comanche words. Listen, Ura means good, and Hakima means tomorrow, and perhaps that is enough. For today, little one, Kim said softly. Your uncle looks tired from his journey. William noted how Kim had positioned herself away from the windows. How she'd obviously kept Clara occupied and happy through the long day. Something warm stirred in his chest, unexpected, but not unwelcome. Did you get everything you needed in town? Kim asked, her dark eyes searching his face. Some things, William answered carefully. Some answers bring more questions. Kim nodded, understanding what he didn't say. Clara looked between them, sensing the undercurrent, but not quite grasping it. I'll start supper, she announced, rising. With the authority of a practiced housekeeper despite her young age, as Clara bustled about the kitchen, Liam sank into his chair, the day's weight settling heavy on his shoulders. Kim remained by the fire, her presence somehow both foreign and familiar in his home. The railroad men, she said quietly. They were at the river today. William nodded. Marking boundaries that don't rightly exist. Not yet, Kim agreed. Her fingers touched the hidden pocket where William knew she kept the treaties. But they believe paper and money make stronger marks than truth or memory. The fire crackled, throwing shadows on the wall. Outside, darkness gathered close around the house, and with it came the feeling that time was growing short. Decisions would need to be made, stands taken, but for now, there was only this moment. Clara humming in the kitchen, the warmth of the fire. And the strange peace of knowing that whatever came tomorrow, he'd chosen the right path today. Dawn painted the sky in soft pinks and grays as William led the Mustang from the barn. The horse's wounds had begun to heal, though dark scabs still marked where the barbed wire had torn its flesh. Kim stood quietly by the corral, wrapped in a borrowed shawl against the morning chill. "Are you certain about this?" William asked. Adjusting the saddle straps, Kim's fingers traced the Mustang's scarred shoulder. "He will carry us true," she said. "He knows what depends on this day." William had chosen to take the back trails to town, avoiding the main road where curious eyes might spot them. Kim sat behind him on the Mustang, her hands light but steady on his waist. The morning was quiet, except for the soft thud of hooves and the occasional call of winter birds. They'd left Clara with strict instructions to keep to the house. "But I want to come," she'd protested, her face pinched with worry. "You'll have your part to play soon enough," Kim had promised, smoothing the girl's hair. "For now, we need you safe." The church stood empty when they arrived, just as Reverend Amos had arranged. William helped Kim dismount, noting how she squared her shoulders before ascending the steps. Inside, lamplight flickered against the windows. The Reverend had been expecting them. "Welcome," Amos said softly, emerging from his study. "Others will arrive shortly. I've chosen carefully those who might listen with open hearts." Kim nodded, her composure steady despite the tension William could feel in her bearing. They settled into the front pew, waiting as morning light gradually filled the sanctuary through its simple glass windows. The first to arrive was Tom Mackenzie, an older rancher whose land bordered the river. His wife Sarah followed, clutching her Bible. Then came the Miller brothers, James and Robert, who ran the general store. Dr. Peterson slipped in quietly, followed by 3 more farming families. William knew to be fair-minded. Reverend Amos closed the doors once 12 people had gathered. "Friends," he began, his voice carrying the weight of his office. "I've asked you here because a matter of justice requires our attention." William watched the assembled faces as Amos explained the situation in broad strokes. There were frowns of concern, but no immediate rejection. These were people who believed in hearing all sides of a story. When Kim stood to speak, the room grew perfectly still. She moved to the front with quiet dignity, the treaty papers carefully preserved in her hands. "My husband," she began, her English clear, though softly accented, believed in building bridges between peoples. He worked for the Indian Agency as a translator, helping both sides understand each other's words and hearts. She unfolded the documents with reverent care. "These papers bear witness to promises made. The riverlands were to be shared, grazing rights protected for both settlers and Comanche. My husband kept these safe, knowing their importance." Sarah Mackenzie leaned forward. "But dear, why come forward now? Why not when the agreements were first made?" "Because those who opposed sharing the land burned our home," Kim answered simply. "They killed my husband, thinking the treaties died with him, but he had entrusted them to me, and our Mustang carried them to safety." William noticed how the women in the room softened at this. They understood about carrying on after loss, about keeping faith with those they'd loved. Dr. Peterson adjusted his spectacles, studying the papers Kim had laid out. "These appear genuine," he said slowly. "The seals, the signatures, all proper and official." "The railroad men won't care about that," James Miller said, though his tone held more resignation than rejection. "They've got money and influence behind them, then we must care all the more," Reverend Amos responded. "If we stand silent while treaties are broken and rights stripped away, what does that say about our own honor?" A murmur of consideration rippled through the group. William recognized the struggle in their faces. Good people weighing difficult choices. "May I speak?" All heads turned as Clara's voice rang out from the back of the church. William started to rise, shocked at her presence. But Kim's hand on his arm stopped him. Clara walked forward, her steps determined despite her obvious nervousness. "I know I'm just a girl," she said, "but I've seen things these past days that matter." No one interrupted as Clara described how Kim had taught her Comanche words, had shown her how to braid leather into stronger rope, had told her stories about how the river belonged to everyone because water was life itself. "And the Mustang," Clara continued, her voice growing stronger. "He protected those papers even when he was hurt so bad. He knew they were important. If a horse can be that faithful to what's right, shouldn't we try to be the same?" Sarah Mackenzie wiped her eyes with a handkerchief. Tom reached for his wife's hand, his weathered face thoughtful. The Miller brothers exchanged long looks. "The girl speaks truth," Robert Miller said finally. "Simple truth, but sometimes that's the kind we need most." "We'll need more support," James added practically. "Other ranchers, townsfolk who remember what it means to keep your word. And we'll need to move carefully," Dr. Peterson cautioned. "The railroad men won't take kindly to interference with their plans." Reverend Amos nodded. "We'll gather again, bring others we trust. But quietly, carefully, no open talk in town yet." The meeting dissolved gradually, people leaving one or two at a time to avoid drawing attention. Each one stopped to shake Kim's hand, their initial reserve replaced by cautious respect. The sun was setting by the time William, Kim, and Clara mounted the Mustang for home. Clara sat in front, William behind her, with Kim at the rear. The horse moved surely, despite its healing wounds, as if it understood its part in the day's events. "I'm sorry I disobeyed," Clara said softly as they rode. "But I couldn't stay home. Not when it mattered so much." "Your words touched hearts," Kim replied. "Sometimes the young see clearest what the old have forgotten." William felt Kim's slight shiver as the evening air grew cooler. "You spoke well today," he said over his shoulder. "It made them see you as a person, not just a cause." "They are good people," Kim acknowledged, "but such openness brings risk. The railroad men have ears everywhere, and money speaks louder than conscience to some." The Mustang picked its way carefully along the darkening trail. Above them, the first stars began to appear, bright and distant. William thought about the faces in the church, the way understanding had gradually replaced suspicion. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was a beginning. Clara leaned back against his chest, tired but content. "We'll be all right, won't we, Uncle William?" "We'll do what's right," he answered, feeling Kim's silent agreement behind him. "And trust that's enough." The lights of the ranch appeared ahead, warm and welcoming in the gathering dusk. They had taken the first step toward justice, but Kim's warning echoed in William's mind. The path ahead would require all the courage and wisdom they could muster. The morning after the church meeting dawned bright and cold, winter sunshine glinting off fresh frost. William stood at his kitchen window, coffee cup warming his hands, watching Kim show Clara how to scatter feed for the chickens. His niece's laughter rang clear across the yard, a sound he hadn't heard since the terrible day her parents' wagon hadn't returned from town. "Like this?" Clara called out, mimicking Kim's smooth, practiced motion. "Yes, just so," Kim answered, her own smile gentle. "Let it fall in a wide arc, so even the timid ones get their share." William took another sip of coffee, noting how naturally the two moved together as if they'd known each other far longer than mere days. Kim's strength was returning steadily, her steps more sure, her complexion warmed by time spent in the winter sun rather than hiding in shadows in the corral. The Mustang lifted its head at their voices, nickering softly. Its wounds were healing clean, thanks to Kim's knowledge of herbs and William's careful tending. Though still cautious, it had begun to accept William's approach, especially when he brought fresh hay or spoke to it in the quiet tones he used. "With nervous colts, Uncle William." Clara's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Kim's teaching me to make corn cakes the way her mother taught her." He set his cup down and joined them in the yard, boots crunching on frozen grass. That's so. Well, I reckon that's a fair sight better than my burnt offerings. Kim's eyes crinkled at the corners, though she kept her voice serious. Clara tells me you once served her bacon so crisp it shattered when she tried to cut it. Now? That's an exaggeration, William protested, but couldn't help smiling at Clara's giggle. Though I'll allow cooking ain't my strongest suit. They moved inside, where Kim showed Clara how to mix the cornmeal just so, adding a pinch of dried herbs she'd found in her medicine pouch. The kitchen filled with warm scents and easy conversation, making the big ranch house feel more like a home than it had in months. But reality insisted on intruding. Mid-morning brought Luke Hansen, one of William's most experienced hands. Hat twisted uncomfortably in his fingers as he stood in the yard. "Mr. Hardin, sir, I got to speak plain," he began, avoiding William's eyes. "Me and Joe Tucker, we can't stay on." "Not with." He gestured vaguely toward the house. "Well, there's talk in town. Don't want no trouble, sir." William kept his voice level, though he felt his jaw tighten. "You've worked this ranch 5 years, Luke. Known me that long, too. When have I ever brought trouble that wasn't worth facing?" Luke shifted his weight, still not meeting William's gaze. "This is different, sir. Railroad men been asking questions. Offering good money for information, too. Joe's got family to think about. So do I." "I understand," William said quietly, though the words tasted bitter. "You'll get your full wages, and a reference if you need it." After Luke left, William stood for a long moment, watching dust settle on the road. 2 good men gone, and likely more to follow. The ranch was already running lean. Losing experienced hands now, with winter not yet done, could prove disastrous downside. He found Kim at the window, her face troubled. "They fear what is coming," she said softly, "as they should. The railroad men do not fight fair." "No," William agreed, "they don't. But neither did whoever burned your home, and you're still standing." She turned to face him, something fierce and proud in her bearing. "My husband believed in the power of truth. Even when it costs us, truth must be told." Clara appeared in the doorway, flour dusting her apron. "The corn cakes are ready," she announced, then faltered at their serious expressions. "Is everything?" "All right." "Just ranch business, little one," Kim assured her, smoothing her expression. "Come, show us what you've made." The day passed in small domestic victories. Clara's corn cakes proved edible, even tasty. Kim taught her to mend a torn shirt with neat, even stitches. William worked with the Mustang, earning its trust bit by bit until it allowed him to check its healing wounds without flinching. But as evening approached, heavy snow clouds gathered overhead. William insisted on moving the Mustang into the barn, not willing to risk its health to the coming storm. The horse followed him willingly enough, seeming to sense the changing weather. After supper, Clara fell asleep over her book by the fire, worn out from the day's activities. William carried her up to bed, Kim following to tuck the quilts around her. They stood together for a moment, watching the girl sleep peacefully. "She is healing, too," Kim whispered, "like the Mustang. Sometimes the wounds we cannot see take longest to mend." William nodded, throat tight with sudden emotion. He remembered Clara's first weeks at the ranch, how she'd barely spoken, moving through days like a shadow of herself. Now her laughter filled the house again, bright and real. They made their way back downstairs as the first snowflakes began to fall. Kim paused by the window, watching the white flurries dance in the lamplight. William built up the fire, its warmth pushing back against the growing cold. "I should check on the Mustang," he said, reaching for his coat. "I will come too," Kim decided, wrapping herself in a shawl. The barn was warm and quiet, filled with the soft sounds of horses breathing and hay rustling. The Mustang stood alert in its stall, but calm, its eyes reflecting the lantern's glow. Kim approached it slowly, speaking gentle words in Comanche. The horse's ears flicked forward, recognizing. Her voice, "He knows you," William observed. "Trusts you." "As I trusted him to carry those papers to safety," Kim replied. "Some bonds go beyond words." She glanced at William, then away, like grief and loneliness. William studied her profile in the lantern light, seeing the strength that carried her forward despite all she'd lost. "Reckon I know something about those," he said quietly. "Yes," she agreed. "I see it in your eyes sometimes. It's the same shadow I carry." Outside, snow fell steadily now, muffling the world in white silence. The Mustang shifted in its stall, breath steaming in the cool air. William found himself speaking of things he rarely voiced aloud. "After Sarah, my wife, passed, I thought the loneliness would ease with time." He touched the rough wood of the stall door. "Hasn't, really? Just learned to live alongside it." Kim nodded slowly. "Among my people, we say grief is like a river. It carries us forward, even when we wish to stay still." She reached out to stroke the Mustang's nose. "But rivers can also bring new life to dry places." They stood in companionable quiet, listening to the horse's steady breathing and the soft pat of snow against the barn roof. William felt something ease in his chest, a tension he'd carried so long he'd almost forgotten its weight. The moment stretched, fragile as a soap bubble, until Kim finally spoke. "We should return. Clara will worry if she wakes and finds us gone." "She's taken to you," William said as they made their way back through the snow. "Hasn't had a woman to look to since her mother died." "She is a gift," Kim replied simply. "Like this shelter you've given us. Some debts can never be repaid. They can only be passed forward to others in need." At the house, they paused to shake snow from their boots. Through the window, they could see the fire's warm glow, promising comfort. Against the growing storm, William caught Kim's gaze, saw his own gratitude for this moment of peace reflected there. The Mustang's whinny echoed faintly from the barn, a reminder of how their paths had crossed and all that still lay ahead. But for now, snow fell softly. Outside and within these walls, something like family was taking root. 3 days passed like water over stones, each moment carrying them closer to the gathering that could change everything. The morning dawned clear but cold, frost painting delicate patterns on the window panes of William's ranch house. Kim stood before the mirror in the spare room, adjusting the simple blue dress she'd borrowed from one of the sympathetic ranch wives. Her fingers trembled slightly as she smoothed the fabric, but her eyes in the reflection held steady determination. "You look real fine," Clara said from the doorway. Already bundled in her Sunday best, Kim turned, managing a small smile. "Your aunt's dress fits well enough. I hope my words today will fit just as true." William waited by the wagon, checking the harness one final time. He'd hitched both the wagon and saddle horse, knowing some folks might take issue with Kim riding alongside him. The treaty papers, carefully wrapped in oilcloth, rested in his coat pocket like a weight of gold. The Mustang watched from the corral, its wounds nearly healed now. Kim paused to touch its nose before climbing into the wagon. "Stay strong, my friend," she murmured in Comanche. "We carry your courage with us." The winter sun cast long shadows as they made their way to town, the wagon wheels crunching through patches of old snow. Clara sat between them on the bench, humming hymns under her breath. William noticed how Kim's back stayed straight despite the cold, dignity wrapped around her like a blanket. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "you won't stand alone." She nodded, eyes fixed on the road ahead. "I know. That gives me strength." The church came into view, its white clapboard walls bright against the pale morning sky. William's breath caught at the number of horses and wagons already gathered. Word had spread far and wide, bringing folks from every ranch and homestead. Within riding distance, more than we expected, Kim observed, her voice carefully neutral. "I reckon that's good." William replied, though his own stomach tightened with uncertainty. Truth needs witnesses. They pulled up to the hitching post, and William helped both Kim and Clara down from the wagon. Reverend Amos stood at the church steps, greeting arrivals with careful warmth. His eyes held concern when they met William's, but his handshake was firm. "Quite a turnout," the preacher said quietly. "Let's pray they've come with open hearts." Inside, the usual Sunday quiet was replaced by the murmur of dozens of conversations, all falling to whispers as Kim entered. William felt the weight of every stare, some curious, some hostile, as they made their way to the front pew. Clara's small hand slipped into Kim's, offering silent support. The church filled quickly. Ranch families squeezing into pews, children balanced on laps, young men standing along the walls. William recognized faces from every part of the county: the Hendersons from the North Valley, the Whitakers who ran sheep in the high country, even old Jake Thompson, who rarely left his remote homestead. Reverend Amos raised his hands for silence, and the congregation settled. "Friends and neighbors," he began, his deep voice carrying to every corner, "we gather today not just for worship, but for truth. Some of you have heard rumors. Some have made judgments. Now we'll hear facts, spoken plain, and consider them with Christian charity." He nodded to Kim, who rose slowly. The rustle of fabric and creak of floorboards seemed thunderous in the hush. She unfolded the treaty papers with steady hands, the morning light from the windows making the official seals gleam. "My husband," she began, her voice clear and measured, served as translator between our peoples. "He believed in the power of honest words to build bridges." She paused, meeting eyes across the congregation. "These papers hold such words, promises made by your government to my people about the riverlands." For the next quarter hour, Kim read directly from the documents, translating complex legal language into simple terms everyone could understand. She explained how the treaty guaranteed water rights and grazing access, how her husband had protected these papers with his life. William watched faces in the crowd, seeing doubt battle with conscience. When Kim described finding her home burned, her husband murdered, several of the ranch wives pressed handkerchiefs to their eyes. They knew too well how precious a homestead could be, how devastating its loss. When Kim finished, William stood beside her. "I've known most of you since I was a boy," he said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "You know I'm not one for speeches. I swear on my brother's grave, these papers are genuine. The story is true. And if we ignore that truth because it's inconvenient, we're no better than the men who burned this woman's home." A murmur ran through the congregation. Reverend Amos stepped forward again, Bible in hand. "Our Lord tells us to care for the widow and the stranger, to uphold justice even when it costs us dear. These papers show a promise made. Will we be a people who honor promises or break them for profit?" Silence fell, heavy as winter snow. Then Martha Henderson, whose family had ranched the valley for 3 generations, stood up. "My William signed papers with the railroad men last year," she said clearly. "Fine words about fair prices and water rights. 6 months later, they changed everything, said the papers didn't matter. I reckon I know something about broken promises." Another woman stood, then another. Soon, 6 ranch wives were on their feet, sharing similar stories of contracts ignored, agreements rewritten, rights stolen through legal trickery. "Ain't right," old Jake Thompson called from the back. "Don't matter if it's Indians or settlers getting cheated. Ain't right, and we all know it." Heads nodded throughout the church. William felt Kim's shoulder brush his as she swayed slightly, emotion finally breaking through her careful control. Clara beamed up at them both, pride shining in her young face. Reverend Amos raised his hands again. "Let us pray," he said, "for wisdom to do what's right and courage to see it through." The meeting dispersed gradually, clusters of people lingering to talk in low voices. Many approached Kim directly, offering awkward but sincere words of support. The Henderson women promised to bring by some spare clothing. Jake Thompson offered use of his spring grazing land if needed, when they finally stepped out into the pale winter sunlight. William felt lighter than he had in weeks. Kim's eyes shone with carefully contained tears as she helped Clara into the wagon. "Your neighbors," she said softly. "They have good hearts under their fear." "Reckon most folks do," William replied, "if you give them chance to show it." They rode home under that gentle winter sun, hope warming them more than its weak rays could. Clara chattered about the children she'd played with after the meeting. The mothers who had smiled at Kim, the promises of support and friendship. At the ranch, the Mustang greeted them with a quiet nicker. Kim went to it immediately, pressing her forehead to its nose, whispering thanks in her native tongue. William watched them, sensing that something had shifted today, not just in town, but in his own heart. Victory felt fragile, like spring ice on the river, but it was victory nonetheless. For now, that was enough. The pink fingers of dawn had barely touched the eastern sky when the first signs of trouble rolled into town. Heavy hoofbeats echoed down the main street as a group of railroad men rode in, their horses' breaths steaming. In the cold morning air, at their head rode Silas Morton, his city clothes stark against the rough frontier backdrop. Behind him, 6 deputies with silver stars pinned to their coats carried rifles across their saddles. The sound of hammering drew townsfolk from their homes and shops. The railroad men moved methodically down the street, nailing up notices on every post and storefront. Think papers printed in bold black letters claimed that all grazing rights now belonged to the railroad company by order of the county court. Martha Henderson stood in her doorway, clutching a notice she'd torn down. "This ain't legal," she called out, her voice shaking. "We were just at church yesterday, hearing the truth about those treaty rights." Silas Morton wheeled his horse around, his smile cold as frost. "The only truth that matters, madam, is what's written in the county records. And those records show the railroad owns these water rights free and clear." Word spread fast across the valley. William was checking the Mustang's healing wounds when he heard the thunder of approaching horses. His heart sank as he counted at least 12 riders coming hard down the road toward his ranch. "Kim," he shouted, "toward the house. Take Clara and run." The posse burst into the yard before Kim could make it to the door. Deputies spread out in a half circle, rifles raised. Silas Morton sat his horse in the center, looking down at William with satisfaction. "William Hardin," Morton called out, "you're under arrest for harboring a known fugitive and conspiracy to present fraudulent documents." William's hand instinctively moved toward his revolver. "Those papers are genuine, Morton, you know it, or you wouldn't be in such a hurry to shut us down." "The papers," Morton sneered, "are clever forgeries. Your Comanche friend is wanted for questioning about her husband's death and the convenient fire that followed." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. William saw Kim freeze in the doorway, Clara's small form behind her. His mind raced, trying to find a way out that wouldn't end in bloodshed. But one of the younger deputies was already on edge, his rifle barrel wavering. The Mustang, sensing the tension, pawed nervously at the ground. When Kim made a sudden move to pull Clara back inside, the deputy's finger tightened on the trigger. The shot cracked across the yard. The Mustang screamed, rearing up as blood bloomed on its shoulder. William drew his revolver in one fluid motion, muscle memory from years of practice taking over. "Hold your fire," he roared, but it was too late. The yard erupted in chaos. Gunshots. split the morning air as William dove behind a water trough. Through the chaos, he saw Kim dragging Clara toward the back of the house. The Mustang bolted, trailing blood, its hooves throwing up clods of frozen earth. William managed to squeeze off 2 careful shots, making the deputies scatter for cover. He had to give Kim and Clara time to escape. "Run!" he shouted. "Get to the hills." More shots rang out. Splinters flew from the water trough. William heard boots crunching on frozen ground behind him, but before he could turn, something hard struck the back of his head. The world tilted sideways as his revolver slipped from nerveless fingers. Rough hands grabbed him, dragging him up. Through blurred vision, he saw 2 deputies rushing into his house. One emerged moments later, holding the lockbox where he'd kept the treaty papers. "Got 'em," the deputy called out triumphantly. "No." William struggled against the hands holding him, but iron cuffs were already closing around his wrists. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard hoofbeats heading toward the hills. At least Kim and Clara had made it out. They threw him into the back of a wagon like a sack of grain. As they drove toward town, he caught glimpses of other ranchers, watching from their properties, faces troubled but turning away. No one stepped forward to help. The jail was a small building of gray stone, cold as a tomb. They marched him past empty cells to the last one, throwing him onto a thin mattress that smelled of mildew. The door clanged shut with awful finality. "Enjoy your stay," Morton said from the other side of the bars. "Your trial for conspiracy and harboring fugitives will be held once we track down your Comanche friend." His boots clicked on the wooden floor as he left, taking the treaty papers with him. The afternoon crawled by like a wounded thing. William paced his cell, 7 steps each way, listening to the wind moan through gaps in the stone. His head throbbed, where they'd struck him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the Mustang falling, heard Clara's frightened cry as evening settled over the town. Voices grew louder outside the jail. A crowd was gathering, their mood ugly. Someone threw a rock against the window. "Traitor, Indian lover. Should have stuck with your own kind." William pressed his forehead against the cold bars, trying to pray, but finding only fragments of old hymns his wife used to sing. Somewhere out in the gathering dark, Kim and Clara were running for their lives, with nothing but the clothes on, their backs to shield them from the bitter wind, the Mustang's blood on the frozen ground, Clara's terrified face, Kim's eyes as she realized they'd lost everything again. These images played over and over in his mind as night fell. The jeering continued outside, punctuated by the thud of rocks against the jail walls in his cell. William slumped onto the thin mattress, his shackled hands pressed against his eyes. All their hopes from yesterday's church meeting lay shattered. Like ice in spring floods, he thought of Kim and Clara, hopefully hidden safely in the pine forests that covered the hills. The bitter wind would be howling through those trees now, driving needles of cold through any shelter they'd found. The treaty papers were gone, their proof stolen by men who valued profit over truth. The Mustang, that proud creature that had brought Kim back to them, lay wounded or dead somewhere in the chaos of their ruined morning. And he sat here, useless behind bars, while everything they'd built crumbled to dust. Outside, another rock struck the window. More jeers rose up from the street. William raised his head, listening to the wind's mournful keening through the jails eaves. It sounded like the cries of a wounded Mustang, like a child's frightened tears. Like all the broken promises that had led them to this dark moment, the winter wind cut through the pines like a knife. But Kim couldn't risk making the fire any larger. She huddled close to the tiny flame, one arm around Clara's shivering shoulders as they watched the Mustang's labored breathing. The horse lay on its side in the shelter of a rocky overhang, its wounded shoulder caked with dried blood. "Hold thee." "Lantern steady," Kim whispered, unwrapping the last of her spare dress to use as bandages. Clara lifted the light with trembling hands, her face pale in its glow. The Mustang's eyes rolled white with pain as Kim pressed clean cloth against the wound. "Will he die?" Clara's voice cracked. Kim paused, choosing her words carefully. "Aki is strong, like his ancestors who ran free on these plains. The bullet passed through clean." She gestured to Clara to hand her the water skin, using precious drops to wash away dried blood. "See how he fights. He knows we need him." The Mustang nickered softly at Kim's touch. She murmured soothing words in Comanche, the language of her. Childhood flowing like water over stones. The horse's breathing steadied as she worked. Clara watched in silence for a long while, then suddenly burst into tears. "I'm scared for Uncle William," she choked out. "What if they hurt him? What if we never see him again?" Kim pulled the girl close, feeling her small body shake with sobs. The fear in Clara's voice echoed her own thoughts, but she couldn't let it show. "Listen to me," she said firmly. "Your uncle is strong too, and we will not abandon him. Promise?" Clara looked up, her face streaked with tears. "I promise on the spirits of the river and sky." Kim touched her heart in the formal gesture of her people. William Hardin stood up for truth when others turned away. We will not leave him to face this alone. Clara wiped her eyes with her sleeve. "The deputies took the papers," she whispered. "How can we prove the truth now?" Kim's hand stilled on the Mustang's wound. "Truth lives in more places than paper," she said softly. "It lives in memory, in witness, in the land itself. We will find a way." The wind moaned through the pines, carrying the scent of snow. Kim finished binding the Mustang's shoulder and covered the horse with her own blanket. They would all need to share warmth tonight to survive. Meanwhile, in the town jail, William paced his cell like a caged wolf. 7 steps forward. Turn. 7 steps back. The stone walls seemed to press closer with each pass, threatening to crush the air from his lungs. His head still throbbed where they'd struck him. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the weight of guilt crushing his chest. He'd thought he was protecting Clara by taking in Kim, by standing up for what was right. Instead, he'd put his niece in danger. Sent her fleeing into the winter night with nothing but the clothes on her back. The sound of boots on wooden floorboards made him freeze. Was it another deputy coming to mock him? Or worse, had they caught Kim and Clara? But the figure that appeared before his cell was Reverend Amos, his lined face grave in the lamplight. "Brother William," the preacher said quietly, "I came as soon as I could." William gripped the iron bars. "Clara, have you heard anything?" "Nothing certain, but the search parties returned empty-handed at sunset. They're safe for now." The Reverend glanced over his shoulder at the empty office. "The deputies are changing guard. We don't have much time." "I failed them, Reverend." William's voice was raw. "I thought I could protect them both, but I've only made things worse." "You did what was right," Amos said firmly. "And this fight isn't over. The Lord works in mysterious ways, William. Sometimes what seems like defeat is just the darkness before dawn." The preacher reached into his coat and withdrew a worn Bible. "They let me bring this for you," said even sinners need salvation. His eyes met William's meaningfully. "You might want to study it carefully, especially the book of Esther about standing up against injustice, no matter the cost." William took the Bible through the bars, feeling its familiar weight. Something about the way Amos emphasized his words made him curl his fingers tighter. "Around the book, thank you," he said carefully. "I'll be sure to read it thoroughly. Guards." A deputy's voice echoed from the front office. "May God be with you, Brother William," Reverend Amos said quickly. Stepping back as heavy boots approached, 2 deputies burst in, rifles ready. "Step away from the prisoner," one ordered, jabbing his weapon toward the preacher. "I was just leaving." Amos raised his hands peacefully. "Remember what I said about Esther, William?" The deputies searched the cell roughly, but finding only the Bible, they left William alone again. He waited until their footsteps faded before sliding down onto his thin mattress. The book clutched to his chest. In the darkness, William ran his fingers over the Bible's leather cover. Something about its weight felt wrong. Carefully, he opened it, holding it close to the faint light from the window. His breath caught. The spine had been carefully split, creating a hidden space. And there, tucked between the pages of Esther, were copies of the treaty papers Kim's husband's neat handwriting documenting the promises made to her people. William quickly slipped the papers back into their hiding place. Tucking the Bible under his blanket, his heart pounded. They weren't beaten yet. Somehow, Kim's husband had known to make duplicates, had planned for treachery. He leaned his head back against the cold stone wall, closing his eyes. Somewhere in the hills, Kim and Clara were huddled. In the darkness, probably hungry and cold, but they were alive. And now, thanks to Reverend Amos, they had a chance to prove the truth. Outside his window, the winter wind still howled. But it no longer sounded like despair to William's ears. Instead, it carried the whisper of hope. As fragile and precious as the hidden papers pressed against his heart, the Mustang's blood on the frozen ground. That morning had seemed like the end of everything. But here in the darkness, William remembered. Kim's quiet strength, Clara's innocent faith, the Reverend's unwavering support. Perhaps this wasn't an ending at all, but the beginning of something stronger than fear or greed. The birth of justice, carried in the heart of a wounded Mustang, a stolen child, and a woman who refused to let truth die. The winter dawn crept. Across the hills in shades of iron and pearl, Kim studied the ground before each step, leading Clara along paths where their tracks would be hidden by patches of exposed rock and fallen pine needles. The Mustang followed quietly behind them, his wound dressed but his gait still unsteady. "Remember what I taught you?" Kim whispered, pointing to their back trail. "Walk where the ground is hard. Leave no signs for trackers to follow." Clara nodded, her face determined despite exhaustion. They'd spent a cold night in the hills, sharing Kim's remaining blanket and what little food they'd managed to grab during their escape. Now, as the sun rose, they made their way carefully back toward town. The church bell tolled 6 times in the distance. Kim paused, scanning the landscape. Smoke rose from chimneys, and she could make out riders moving along the road. Deputies still searching, no doubt. But she knew a back way to Reverend Amos's barn, through a creek bed that would hide their approach. Almost there, she encouraged Clara, who was shivering despite the exercise. Just a little further. The barn came into view through the morning mist. Kim watched it for several long minutes, making certain no one was about, before leading Clara and the Mustang quickly across the open ground. The door creaked softly as they slipped inside. "Thank the Lord," came a whispered voice. Reverend Amos emerged from behind a stack of hay bales. "I've been praying you'd make it safely." Clara ran to him, and he wrapped her in a warm embrace. Kim secured the Mustang in an empty stall, checking his bandages. "William?" she asked quietly, still in jail, but holding strong. The preacher's eyes held a glimmer of hope. "I have something to show you both." He led them up to the hayloft, where he'd created a small hidden space behind some loose boards. From it, he withdrew a leather document case. "Before I gave the treaty papers to William that first day," he explained, "I made copies, spent all night doing it, but something told me we might need them." Kim's hands trembled as she opened the case. There, in careful ink, were exact duplicates of the stolen documents. Her husband's familiar handwriting preserved the promises made to her. People recorded in detail, You knew, she breathed. You knew they might try to destroy the originals. Amos nodded gravely. I've lived here long enough to know how the railroad men operate. They try to erase what stands in their way, but truth has a way of surviving, if good people protect it. Clara peered at the papers. Can we use these to free Uncle William? That's what we're going to try to do, Amos said. But we'll need help. The whole town needs to stand with us this time, not just a few sympathetic souls. They spent the morning planning in whispers, sharing the meager breakfast Amos had brought them. Kim explained how her people built alliances, while the preacher listed which families might be counted on for support throughout the day. Deputies passed near the barn several times, but none thought to search it thoroughly. Kim and Clara stayed hidden in the hayloft, listening to the sounds of the town below: horses, hooves, wagon wheels. Fragments of worried conversation about what was happening in his cell. William endured a different kind of trial. The deputies took turns taunting him, calling him a traitor to his own kind. But he held tight to the Bible Amos had brought, drawing strength from the hidden papers within and the knowledge that Clara and Kim were still free. Ain't so high and mighty now, are you, Hardin? One deputy sneered, rattling the cell bars with his rifle butt. Should have stuck to your own kind instead of helping that Indian woman. William said nothing, just turned another page in his Bible. His silence seemed to frustrate them more than any response could have. As evening approached, Martha Whitfield, the preacher's wife, arrived at the barn carrying a covered basket. The scent of fresh-baked bread filled the air as she climbed to the hayloft. You poor dears must be half-starved, she said, pulling out still warm loaves and a jar of preserves. Eat up now. You'll need your strength. Clara fell on the food eagerly, but Kim hesitated. You risk much helping us, she said softly. Martha's kind face grew stern. My grandfather was a station master on the Underground Railroad, she said. He taught us that there are times when God's justice matters more than man's law. Now eat, both of you. As they shared the simple meal, Martha told them what she'd learned in town. Tension was building. Some families feared violence would erupt if the situation wasn't resolved soon, while others were beginning to question the railroad company's claims. The Millers lost grazing rights last month, she reported, and the Hendersons the month before that. People are starting to see that if they don't stand together now, they'll all lose in the end. Reverend Amos nodded thoughtfully. We need to gather them again, not just a few this time, but everyone. Show them the copies of the treaty. Help them understand what's really at stake. The railroad men will try to stop any meeting, Kim warned. Then we don't call it a meeting, Clara piped up. We call it a prayer service. They can't stop people from coming to church. The adults exchanged surprised looks. From the mouths of babes, Martha said softly. She's right. They wouldn't dare interfere with a prayer service, not with half the county watching. They worked out the details as darkness fell. Amos would announce a special evening service for the next night, spreading word through his most trusted parishioners. Martha would help smuggle in supporters from outlying farms. Kim would speak again, this time with the copied treaties to prove her words. And Clara, Kim said, turning to the girl, I have an important task for you. Clara sat up straighter. What is it? You know every family in town. Which ones are kind, which ones keep their promises. Tomorrow, you'll help Martha spread the word to the right people. Your innocent heart sees truth that grown-ups sometimes miss. Clara's face glowed with purpose. I won't let you down, or Uncle William. Speaking of William, Amos said, I'll visit him again tomorrow. Let him know what we're planning. Having those papers in the Bible will give him hope. Kim stood at the hayloft window, watching the lights of the town below. Somewhere out there, William was holding on to his faith in justice, just as she was holding on to her faith in him. Tomorrow would test them all. Martha gathered her basket to leave. "Bring more food in the morning," she promised, "and blankets. It's too cold up here with just hay for bedding." "Thank you," Kim said softly, "for everything." "Thank me when this is over and Wright has one," Martha replied. "For now, rest. Tomorrow will come soon enough." After she left, Kim settled Clara into a nest of hay, covering her with her shawl. The girl was asleep almost instantly, worn out by their long day. Reverend Amos checked the barn one final time before heading to the house. "I'll leave the lantern," he whispered. "Keep it shielded, but it'll give some comfort in the dark." Kim nodded, already planning the words she would speak tomorrow night. They would have one chance to sway the town. One chance to save William, protect her people's rights, and prove that justice could still triumph over greed. The lantern's small flame cast dancing shadows on the barn walls. Below, the wounded Mustang shifted in his stall, his breathing steady and strong despite his injury. Like them all, he was a survivor. And tomorrow, they would need every ounce of that survival spirit. She touched the copied treaties safely hidden again behind the loose boards. Her husband had died protecting these promises. Now it fell to her and to this unlikely family of allies to make those promises live again. Dawn painted the town square in soft winter light as Reverend Amos stood on the wooden platform normally used for market days. His voice carried clear and strong across the gathering crowd. "Let us pray together, brothers and sisters, for justice and truth in our community." At first, only a handful of people stopped to listen. Then Martha Whitfield stepped forward, followed by elderly Sarah Jenkins, who had lost both her husband and eldest son in range wars years ago. Other ranch wives joined them, their worn faces set with determination. "I've seen what happens when good folks stay silent," Sarah declared, her voice wavering but firm. "My Thomas and young Jimmy died protecting our right to live honest on this land." She turned to face the deputies lounging near the jail entrance. "Shame on you, boys. Some of your own mothers are standing here. Is this how we raised you too? Cage an honest man for helping those in need." Her words struck home. Several deputies shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet the stern gazes of women who had watched them grow up. More townspeople drifted into the square, drawn by the growing crowd. Mary Peterson, whose family had ranched the valley for 3 generations, spoke next. "We've all lost something to broken promises. Now we watch while railroad men try to break another." The crowd's murmurs grew louder. Kim stepped forward then, the duplicate treaty papers held carefully in her hands. Clara stood beside her, small fingers gripped tight in the folds of Kim's skirt. "My husband died protecting these words," Kim said, her voice carrying across the hushed square. "He believed in the promise between your people and mine. He gave his life so that truth would not be buried." She held the papers high, sunlight catching the careful ink strokes. "Here is that truth, written clear as day. The riverlands were promised to both our peoples to share in peace." Inside his cell, William pressed close to the barred window, hearing the swell of voices from the square. The sound of unified protest grew stronger, first dozens of voices, then scores, calling for his release and for justice to be done. Hope bloomed in his chest as he recognized Kim's voice rising above the others. Strong and sure, the people of the town, his neighbors, his community, were finally taking their stand. The summer sun blazed overhead as tension filled the square. Railroad men pushed through the crowd, demanding immediate justice, but found their path blocked by determined townsfolk standing shoulder to shoulder. "Stand aside," one railroad man shouted. "This man's trial starts now." But the crowd held firm. Reverend Amos strode purposefully toward the jail, his Bible clutched tight. "Release William Hardin," he commanded the deputies. "You've held an innocent man long enough." At that moment, hoofbeats echoed across the square. Kim appeared on the wounded Mustang, Clara seated behind her. The horse limped, but carried them proudly. Kim dismounted, treaty papers held high. "Here is your proof," she declared, voice ringing clear. "Read it yourselves." The deputies shifted uneasily as townspeople passed the documents hand to hand. Mutters of agreement spread through the crowd. The evidence was undeniable. The jailer's keys rattled, and William stepped into the sunlight. Clara ran to him, throwing her arms around his waist. He held her close, then met Kim's eyes with silent, profound gratitude. Oil lamps cast a warm glow through the church windows as evening settled over the town. Inside, the pews filled with families gathered for a Thanksgiving service. William sat beside Kim and Clara in the front row, with Reverend Amos nearby, their faces peaceful in the gentle light. One by one, neighbors approached to offer heartfelt apologies. "We were wrong to doubt," Mrs. Peterson said softly, squeezing Kim's hand. "Your courage showed us better." The ranch wives had covered tables with steaming dishes, fresh bread, stewed venison, and apple pies filling the air with welcome. Their offering of food spoke louder than words about healing and unity. As the congregation shared the meal, William turned to Kim and Clara. "My ranch has room enough for 3, he said quietly. "If you'd consider making it your home too." His eyes held hope and certainty. Kim's tears glimmered in the lamplight as she nodded. "We will face tomorrow together," she answered, her dignity unshaken by all they'd endured. Outside in the frosty night, the Mustang grazed peacefully, its bandaged flank a reminder of their shared struggles and triumph. At sunrise, days later, the morning dew sparkled on the grass as life settled into familiar rhythms at the Hardin Ranch. Clara hummed softly while helping Kim hang sheets on the line, the fresh cotton snapping in the breeze. William worked steadily on the barn roof, hammering new shingles into place. The Mustang, still bearing the marks of its ordeal, limped carefully into the pasture. Its wounds were healing, much like the bonds between them all. William saddled 3 horses, and together they rode to the river's edge. The water flowed steady and clear, marking the boundary of land now secured by treaty. They dismounted near a stand of cottonwoods, bowing their heads in shared prayer. "Thank you, Lord," William whispered, "for mercy, justice, and new beginnings." He reached for Kim's hand, their fingers intertwining naturally. They watched Clara skip stones across the water, her laughter echoing off the riverbank. Their family, bound not by blood, but by something deeper, faith, courage, and grace, had found its home at last. Thanks for taking a moment to feel with me. If this story reminded you of what matters, hit subscribe. I'll be here tomorrow, continuing our story.